Some stories are carved into stone. Others survive only because someone was brave enough to whisper them before they died. Across the plantations of the American South, thousands of voices disappeared beneath the weight of chains, cotton fields, and silence. The names of governors, generals, and wealthy plantation owners filled official records. But the names of the enslaved were often forgotten, erased, as if their suffering had never happened. Yet every so often a story escaped, not because it was written in a newspaper, not because a judge recorded it, but because people remembered. Old men sitting beside winter fires told it to grandchildren. Women quietly repeated it while hanging laundry beneath oak trees. Former slaves carried fragments of it into freedom after the Civil War, each version changing a little, yet keeping the same chilling ending. They always ended with the same sentence. The overseer never lived to see Christmas morning. Whether every detail happened exactly as told can never be proven. But the cruelty behind the tale reflected a reality experienced by countless enslaved people across the South. The winter of 1858 settled unusually early over central Georgia. The cotton harvest had nearly ended, leaving behind endless rows of dry stalks stretching toward the gray horizon. Frost clung to broken fences every dawn before melting into muddy paths that connected the slave quarters to the great plantation house. Cold weather brought little comfort. The fields remained busy. The work never truly stopped. Repairs had to be made. Firewood had to be cut. Animals needed feeding. New land waited to be cleared before spring. Every sunrise began with the sharp blast of a horn, pulling exhausted bodies from thin blankets long before daylight reached the cabins. Among them was a young enslaved woman named Sarah. She was only 26 years old, though years of relentless labor made her appear much older. Her hands were rough from picking cotton. Small scars crossed her wrists, where thorn bushes had torn her skin season after season. Despite everything, Sarah carried herself with remarkable quiet strength. The older women often said she had gentle eyes that reminded them of someone who still believed tomorrow might somehow be kinder than today. She shared a tiny cabin with her elderly mother, Ruth, and her 6-year-old son, Isaiah. Their home was barely large enough for 3 straw mattresses laid across the wooden floor. Wind slipped through cracks between the boards every night. Rain sometimes leaked through the roof. Still, Ruth insisted on sweeping the dirt floor every morning. Even if they own the house, she whispered one day, they don't own our dignity. Sarah never forgot those words. Neither would Isaiah. Life on the Carter plantation revolved around one man almost as much as the owner himself. His name was Elias Turner. The plantation owner lived comfortably inside the white columned mansion overlooking hundreds of acres. Turner lived much closer to the fields. He was the overseer, tall, broad-shouldered, and always carrying a heavy leather whip at his side. Turner believed fear was the quickest way to increase production. He rarely smiled. When he did, workers grew even more frightened. His boots could often be heard before sunrise, crunching across frozen ground while lantern light danced around him. The sound alone caused conversations inside the cabins to stop instantly. Children learn to recognize those footsteps before they learn to read faces. Turner believed kindness weakened authority. He punished anyone who slowed the work, anyone who looked tired, anyone who spoke without permission. Sometimes punishment came for no reason anyone could understand. He called it discipline. Everyone else called it survival. Sarah tried to remain invisible whenever he passed. She lowered her eyes, answered only when spoken to, worked until her muscles shook from exhaustion. Still, Turner seemed to notice her more often than others. Perhaps because she refused to let hatred show on her face. Perhaps because her quietness unsettled him. Or perhaps because cruel men often searched for those least able to fight back. As December approached, sickness spread through the quarters. The freezing nights and damp air filled cabins with coughing. Children developed fevers. Older workers struggled to breathe. Medicine was almost non-existent. Most relied on roots, herbs, and remedies remembered from generations before slavery. Ruth gathered pine needles, boiled willow bark, mixed herbs wrapped carefully inside cloth bundles. Sometimes they worked. Often they did not. One evening, Sarah returned from the fields shivering uncontrollably. Her hands trembled so badly. She dropped the wooden bucket she had carried home. Isaiah rushed forward. "Mama?" She forced a smile. "I'm just tired." But Ruth saw the truth immediately. She touched Sarah's forehead. Her hand pulled away almost instantly. "She's burning." By morning, Sarah could barely stand. Still, the horn sounded. Still, everyone was expected to work. Turner arrived outside the cabins before dawn. Workers slowly gathered despite illness and exhaustion. Sarah leaned against the doorway, struggling to breathe. Turner's sharp eyes found her immediately. "Move," she tried. Her knees buckled. She collapsed into the frozen dirt. The overseer stared down at her. "You think lying in the mud gets you out of work?" Ruth stepped forward carefully. "Sir, she's sick." Turner looked at the older woman with cold amusement. "They're always sick when there's work to be done." He ordered 2 men to lift Sarah. They obeyed without speaking, not because they lacked compassion, because refusing meant punishment for everyone. Sarah was carried toward the fields, barely conscious. Every step seemed to steal another breath. By noon, she could no longer pick cotton. The basket beside her remained nearly empty. Turner rode past on horseback. He stopped, dismounted, walked slowly toward her. The entire field became silent. No bird sang. No tool struck the earth. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Turner grabbed Sarah's shoulder and forced her upright. "You expect someone else to finish your row?" She whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. "What?" "I can't." The words barely escaped her lips. Turner's face hardened. He shoved her backward. Sarah fell heavily against frozen ground. Isaiah, who had been carrying water to nearby workers, saw everything. Without thinking, he ran toward his mother. Before he could reach her, another worker caught him gently around the shoulders. "No," the man whispered desperately. "Please, don't." The boy struggled. Tears streamed across his face. His mother lay motionless. Turner glanced toward Isaiah with visible annoyance before turning back toward the workers. This is what happens when laziness spreads. Nobody answered. Nobody dared. Late that afternoon, Sarah was finally carried back to the quarters. Her breathing had become shallow. Each breath sounded painful. Ruth remained beside her through the night. Isaiah refused to sleep. Outside, cold wind rattled bare branches against cabin roofs. Inside, candles flickered weakly. Sarah opened her eyes only once. She looked toward her son. Be kind. Those were nearly the last clear words anyone heard her speak. The following morning, the plantation awoke beneath an icy blanket of frost. Christmas was only 3 days away. The owner prepared decorations inside the great house. Fresh evergreen branches hung across the entrance. Special meals were planned. Guests were expected. Music would soon fill the grand dining room. Less than half a mile away, Sarah could no longer rise from her bed. Word spread quietly among the cabins. Many believed she would not survive another day. Ruth begged permission for Sarah to remain inside. The request reached Turner shortly after sunrise. He answered without hesitation, "If she can breathe, she can work." No one knew then that those words, and what would happen before Christmas dawn, would become the beginning of a story remembered for generations, whispered wherever people still believe that cruelty eventually meets its reckoning. The wind grew colder with each passing night, carrying the scent of damp earth and smoke across the Carter plantation. Christmas Eve was approaching, but there was no feeling of celebration inside the slave quarters. Instead, every cabin seemed wrapped in a heavy silence. The people had learned that hope could be dangerous. Hope often led to disappointment. Yet, as Sarah's condition worsened, even those who had buried their faith long ago found themselves quietly praying that she might somehow survive until morning. Inside the small cabin, Ruth sat beside her daughter without moving. A kettle of herbs simmered weakly over the fire, filling the room with a bitter smell of pine and willow bark. Isaiah slept with his head resting against his mother's arm, refusing to leave her side. Every few minutes, Sarah's breathing became shallower, as though each breath required more strength than the last. Outside, life continued, as though nothing had happened. The horn sounded before dawn. The wagons rolled toward the fields. Axes struck frozen timber. Mules pulled heavy loads across muddy roads. Only the people living in the quarters understood that one of their own was slipping quietly toward death. The plantation owner, William Carter, remained occupied preparing for Christmas guests. His wife supervised servants decorating the grand house with evergreen branches, candles, and ribbons imported from Savannah. The dining room filled with expensive silverware, polished until it reflected the candlelight like mirrors. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Luxury stood only a short walk away from unbearable suffering. Yet the distance between those two worlds felt greater than an ocean. Turner showed no concern for Sarah's condition. "If she's alive tomorrow," he told another driver, "she'll return to work." The man beside him lowered his eyes. Even among those who worked under Turner, few admired him. Fear had earned him obedience. It had never earned respect. That afternoon, Ruth made one final request. She walked slowly to the overseer's office, carrying nothing but her worn shawl around her shoulders. Every step felt dangerous. Elderly slaves rarely questioned authority unless desperation left them no other choice. Turner looked up from his ledger as she entered. What now? My daughter is dying. His expression remained unchanged. I know. Please, let the doctor see her. There'll be no doctor. Ruth clasped her trembling hands together. She has a little boy. Turner leaned back in his chair. So do half the women here. Please, he stood abruptly. I said enough. His voice echoed through the small building. If she dies, another worker will replace her. The word struck Ruth harder than any whip. For several seconds she simply stared at him, not with anger, not with hatred, only heartbreak. Then she quietly turned away. She never begged again. As darkness settled over the plantation, snowflakes began drifting gently through the Georgia sky. It was rare enough that even the children stepped outside to watch them fall. Isaiah caught one tiny flake on his finger before running back inside. Mama, Sarah slowly opened her eyes. It's snowing. For a moment, the faintest smile touched her face. I've always liked the snow. Her voice was barely audible. Isaiah smiled back, believing she was getting better. Ruth knew otherwise. She recognized the strange calm that sometimes arrived before death. Word spread from cabin to cabin. Workers quietly visited throughout the evening. Some brought herbs. Others carried pieces of bread saved from their own meals. One elderly man softly played an old spiritual on a handmade fiddle outside the cabin door. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody wanted Turner to hear. Inside, Sarah drifted between sleep and wakefulness. Sometimes she whispered names from long ago. Sometimes she spoke to her late father as though he stood nearby. Near midnight, she reached for Isaiah's hand. You must remember. The boy leaned closer. What, Mama? No matter what they do, she struggled to breathe. Don't let them steal your heart. Isaiah nodded through tears. I promise. She gently squeezed his fingers. It would be the last time. Just before sunrise on Christmas Eve, Sarah's breathing stopped. No cry escaped her lips. No struggle, only silence. Ruth closed her daughter's eyes. The small cabin remained completely still. Isaiah buried his face against the blanket, unable to understand why his mother no longer answered him. Outside, another workday had already begun. The horn sounded once again. Within minutes, Turner arrived. He pushed open the cabin door without knocking. His boots carried mud onto the wooden floor. He looked briefly toward Sarah's body. So, nobody answered. Ruth remained kneeling beside her daughter. Turner frowned impatiently. The others should already be working. Still no response. He stepped closer. I said enough mourning. The cabin remained silent except for Isaiah's quiet sobbing. Turner's face darkened. What good is crying now? Then, with a cruel laugh, he looked down at Sarah's lifeless face. She finally found an excuse not to work. Several workers standing outside lowered their heads. Some clenched their fists behind their backs. No one dared move. Turner took another step forward. He stared at the woman who had spent her entire life laboring in his fields. Then, in an act of shocking contempt, he spat toward her still body. The sound echoed through the silent cabin. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Isaiah stared in disbelief. Ruth slowly lifted her head. She did not scream. She did not curse him. Instead, tears rolled quietly down her weathered face. Her voice remained calm. So God has seen. Turner laughed. God? He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. If your God cared, she'd still be alive. Without another word, he turned and walked outside. His boots disappeared into the snow. Behind him, the cabin remained frozen in silence. No one who witnessed the moment would ever forget it. That afternoon, Sarah was buried beneath a simple oak tree near the edge of the woods where many enslaved people rested without names carved into stone. No preacher stood beside the grave. No church bells rang. Only family, friends, and fellow workers gathered quietly after sunset. Someone sang a soft spiritual. Another placed a small wooden cross near the fresh earth. Isaiah dropped a single pine cone onto the grave. "It's from our tree," he whispered. "I wanted you to have Christmas." Even on the strongest men wiped tears from their faces. Far away, laughter drifted from the plantation house where Christmas Eve celebrations had already begun. Music spilled through open windows. Guests danced. Glasses were raised in celebration. Turner drank heavily among the drivers and stable hands before riding back toward his quarters well after dark. The snowfall had become heavier. The roads disappeared beneath fresh white blankets. The plantation looked strangely peaceful. Yet many of the older workers watched the falling snow with uneasy expressions. An elderly woman named Dinah quietly spoke as they stood outside their cabins. "There are nights," she whispered, "when the earth remembers." Nobody asked what she meant. Old stories had long been shared among the enslaved. Stories of justice arriving in unexpected ways. Stories of cruel men brought low without warning. Stories impossible to explain. Most dismissed them. Some secretly believed. As midnight approached, strange sounds drifted across the frozen fields. Dogs that normally barked without reason suddenly became silent. The horses inside the stable stamped nervously. Owls called from deep within the woods. A bitter wind swept through the plantation with unusual force, rattling every cabin door. Turner, meanwhile, remained alone inside his small house, unaware that the longest night of his life had only just begun. Before another sunrise touched the frozen cotton fields, something would happen that no one on the Carter plantation would ever forget. And by Christmas morning, the man who believed himself untouchable would face a fate that would become legend among those who survived to tell the tale. Christmas Day arrived beneath a sky the color of cold iron. Before dawn, the plantation lay silent beneath a thin blanket of snow. The cotton fields, usually alive with shouted orders and the groan of wagons, seemed strangely untouched, as though the land itself had paused to remember the woman buried beneath the old oak. Inside the slave quarters, no one slept deeply. Sarah's death had left a wound that words could not heal. Mothers held their children closer. Fathers stared silently into dying fires. Even the youngest could feel that something had changed. Only Isaiah remained awake. Wrapped in his mother's old shawl, he sat beside the small cabin window, watching snowflakes drift through the darkness. His grandmother, Ruth, quietly placed another piece of wood onto the fire. "Your mother used to love mornings like this," she whispered. Isaiah nodded. "I know." Neither of them cried. Their tears had already fallen. Now there was only silence. Across the plantation, the Carter family prepared for Christmas breakfast. Candles glowed inside every window of the great house. Fresh bread baked in the kitchen. Guests laughed over coffee beside roaring fireplaces. Outside, servants hurried through the colt-carrying baskets and firewood. To those inside the mansion, Christmas promised comfort. To those inside the cabins, it reminded them how differently human lives could be valued. Only one man failed to appear, Elias Turner. At first, nobody noticed. He often rose before everyone else, inspecting the stables long before sunrise. But as daylight slowly spread across the fields, the stable hands exchanged puzzled glances. His horse remained inside its stall. His office was locked. His cabin showed no sign of movement. One of the drivers knocked firmly. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, another man pushed against the wooden door. It creaked open. The room inside was bitterly cold. The fireplace had burned itself into gray ash. Turner's untouched supper still sat upon the table. His heavy coat hung beside the door exactly where he had left it. But Turner himself was nowhere to be seen. The search began almost immediately. Men spread through the plantation carrying lanterns despite the morning light. Some searched the stables. Others followed wagon roads, disappearing beneath fresh snow. William Carter grew increasingly irritated. Find him. The order echoed across the plantation. No one imagined the answer waiting beyond the frozen creek. Just after sunrise, one of the stable boys stopped suddenly. His lantern nearly slipped from his hand. There! The others hurried forward. At the bottom of a narrow ravine, partly covered by drifting snow, lay Elias Turner. His body rested awkwardly against the frozen earth. His hat had landed several feet away. One arm reached upward as though he had tried desperately to pull himself free. There were no signs of another person nearby, only his own footprints leading toward the creek, and none returning. The plantation doctor arrived shortly afterward. He examined the body carefully. Turner's neck had been broken in the fall. The steep bank had become dangerously slick beneath the fresh snow. According to the doctor, Turner had likely lost his footing sometime during the night while riding alone. Death would have come quickly. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet something unsettled those who stood nearby. His horse had already returned safely to the stable hours earlier. No one understood why Turner had left the road, or why he had been walking beside the frozen creek instead of riding. Questions lingered. Answers never came. By afternoon, whispers spread from cabin to cabin. The overseer is dead. Workers spoke the words carefully, almost afraid they might not be true. Some refused to believe it until they saw his empty horse standing alone. Others crossed themselves quietly. Many simply stared toward Sarah's grave beneath the oak tree. Nobody celebrated. Life had taught them that joy could be dangerous. Instead, they remembered. They remembered the insults, the beatings, the families torn apart, the children left orphaned, the old men worked until they collapsed, the women forced beyond human endurance. They remembered Sarah. Most of all, they remembered what Turner had done inside that cabin only hours before his own death. An elderly woman named Dinah finally broke the silence. "I've lived through 68 winters," she said softly. "I've buried children. I've buried brothers. I've buried friends. But I've learned one thing. The earth may wait, but it never forgets." Her words passed quietly from one person to another. Before long, they became part of the story itself. William Carter wasted little time hiring another overseer. The work resumed. The horn sounded. The wagons rolled. The cotton would be planted again when spring returned. Plantations rarely paused for grief. To the owners, labor mattered more than mourning. But something invisible had changed. The new overseer arrived carrying no whip on his first day. Whether from caution or fear, no one could say. He had already heard what happened to the man before him. The workers noticed. He shouted less, punished less, watched his own steps more carefully whenever winter rain made the roads slippery. Even he avoided mentioning Sarah's name. Isaiah grew older beneath the same Georgia sky that had watched his mother's final days. Years passed. The Civil War erupted across the South. Cannons thundered over distant hills. Families were divided. Plantations emptied as armies marched through once quiet countryside. Then at last freedom came. Not easily, not quickly, but it came. The chains that had defined generations were finally broken by law, though the wounds they left would take far longer to heal. Isaiah became a grown man. Those who knew him often remarked upon his remarkable kindness. He worked honestly, raised children of his own, never answered cruelty with cruelty. Whenever someone asked why he treated others with such patience after everything he had endured, he would quietly repeat the final words his mother ever spoke. "Don't let them steal your heart." Those words became his inheritance, more valuable than land, more lasting than wealth. Long after Ruth passed away, Isaiah continued visiting the old oak tree where Sarah rested. There was never an expensive monument, no polished marble, only a simple wooden marker replaced again and again whenever time or weather wore it away. He believed some graves needed no grand memorial. The people who remembered were monument enough. As decades slipped into history, the Carter plantation slowly disappeared. Buildings collapsed. Fields returned to forest. Roads faded beneath weeds. Travelers passing through the countryside saw little evidence that hundreds of lives had once been shaped there. But stories are harder to bury than buildings. Old descendants repeated the tale during winter evenings. Former slaves carried it into churches after emancipation. Children listened beside fireplaces, while grandparents lowered their voices at the same unforgettable moment. The overseer spat upon a dying woman. He never lived to see Christmas morning. Whether every detail survived exactly as it happened, history cannot always answer. Legends often grow where written records fall silent. Yet the deeper truth needs no embellishment. The institution of slavery was built upon countless acts of cruelty that rarely appeared in official documents. The suffering of enslaved people was real, their resilience undeniable, and many stories of courage, compassion, and quiet resistance were preserved only through oral tradition after generations of silence. Perhaps that is why stories like Sarah's continue to endure. Not because they promise supernatural justice, not because they guarantee every cruel person meets an immediate end, but because they remind us that dignity can survive even when freedom is stolen. Sarah owned nothing the law recognized. No property, no rights, no protection. Yet in her final moments, she gave her son something no overseer could ever take, a heart that refused to become like those who had broken hers. And perhaps that is the greatest victory hidden within forgotten history. Not revenge, not fear, but humanity refusing to die even in the darkest corners of America's past.